We lose our playfulness of childhood as we get older, and it kind of gets indoctrinated out of us in some sense.
Scott Livingston is a highly experienced athletic therapist, strength and conditioning coach, and reconditioning professional with over 35 years in the human performance industry.
When you truly fail, it's because something hasn't worked out and you don't learn from it. When things don't work out, you don't really know whether it was supposed to be that way or not. And oftentimes when you look back at when it didn't work out, you can actually trace a path to something that did work out. The ones that fail to be as good as they could be is usually because they talk to the athlete rather than with the athlete.
What is it that you felt like you were solving for when you created that gap that you saw?
Well,
So welcome to the Evolving Athletes Podcast with Coach Vinny Malts. Today's guest is someone whose work I've admired for a long time, not just the impact that he's had in human performance, but for the way he's navigated the change, purpose, and legacy over decades in sport now. Scott Livingston has worked with elite athletes, coached at the highest level, and now spends his time helping others grow in their craft. On a personal level, Scott has been a great friend and mentor to me, someone I've looked up to, learned from, and been inspired by over the years. He's had a big influence, not only on how I think about performance, but on how I think about life and the way we evolve as people. So what really excites me about this conversation is that Scott's story isn't just about performance, it's about evolution and how you carry the lessons of one phase into the next. Scott, welcome to the show, brother.
thanks for having me, Vinny, and I'm honored to be your first guest. So this should be a lot of fun. We always have dynamic conversations. So
amen to that. Amen to that. So, we'll start off as we jump in. I'd love for you to talk about, before the coaching, before the mentoring, before Leave Your Mark, what's the first memory you have of being drawn into the world of sport and performance?
Good question. Well, I played elite football in my childhood from about age 10 until age 19. And that was actually when you spoke in the intro about the concept of identity. I really identified in my kind of teen life as a football player. It was funny because I always wondered whether I would have been a hockey player. But when I was starting to play, it was back in the days where you would still go to outdoor rinks. They didn't have always full rinks that participate in. We were like little, keeners at 4 or 5 years old, and our fathers would put skates on our feet, and we'd go out, and, the little face thing that you put over your teeth and everything. Barely even helmets. And I liked hockey a lot, but my father was a diplomat. And when I was about 7 years old, we moved to England. And when we moved to England, I didn't get to play for 3 years. So when I came back, I was kind of behind my cohort of kids in skating and playing. And so I was always sort of on the back. It was never a sport that I could sort of catch up on. And so I played a lot of recreational hockey, but never AA or AAA. But I was a big kid and loved football. So I got introduced to football and started playing football, and was an all-star in high school, and was playing junior ball, was recruited to play university ball. So playing football was my introduction to, call it, performance. It's what instigated me strength training, getting, at a bench press club in high school where we were all trying to get the 225 and and I built a gym in my basement with my buddies. We took cold rolled steel bars because you couldn't buy this gear at the store quite easily. We didn't have a lot of money. So we actually went to a steel manufacturing place and got the guy to cut us bars. And then we bought collars and bought plates and created bars in our basement. We built a lat pull down with pulleys, and we had all this stuff that we'd built in my basement and a buddy's basement so we could lift. And it was bench and squat and, all the big lifts. And That was high performance back in those days. You didn't have
Yeah.
a lot of sports science around it. And, you were
Mhm.
reading Muscle and Fitness and all the bodybuilding books. And I loved Arnold Schwarzenegger when I was a kid. Like him, him and Bill Kazmaier, who was a big power lifter of the time, world's strongest man. Those were the guys that I looked up to. And then I was a Steelers fan, and the Steelers had Mike Webster and all these guys who had these massive guns. They were strength training back in the 70s and 80s. And so that was my introduction to, I would call, high performance back in the day, that got me sort of interested in all that stuff.
I love that. I love that. And what's so fascinating, right? It's like the old school days of how much it's like we're just using our brains to go make up games and make up ways. And it's so fascinating, right? That football led you into that world of like, all right, I'm going to just start to put stuff together. Like I remember back in the day having, I created one of those, what are those, the bells, the club bells. And I went to, where was it? I went to like Home Depot or something like that, and literally just putting things together just to make the weight and pulling it together. So I love that story, right? Of like how you are already sensing it and feeling it, right? In that way of like, all right, how am I going to solve for this issue of, I want to do these things, I want to perform better, but your brain was already naturally moving towards that. And that's what I love about, this conversation as we dive into this, which is unreal.
I used to actually go in my basement by myself. This is what frustrates me too about phones today. I used to have a skateboard and a net in my basement, and
Yeah.
and tennis balls, and I would, no word of a lie, spend hours down the basement imagining myself in this league of skateboard hockey. And I had
So cool.
players, and I was doing play-by-play in my mind and shooting these cool shots and and I would do this for hours and hours on my own, like,
That's
just
so cool.
entertain myself instead of going to a phone and staring at it back in the day, like, it's great.
That's so cool. Well, then let's talk about that now, right? If we caught you on a regular day right now, right? What might we see? What does that look like these days? Although I'd love to have
Yeah.
gone back those days.
Well, it's funny that you asked that, because I often think about that when sort of trying to influence other people, is that we lose our playfulness of childhood as we get older, and it kind of gets indoctrinated out of us in some sense. And not for everybody. I think there's some great people who stay connected to that, but sometimes they become in some sense, identified community-wise as the wild ones or the crazy people or whatever, doing all
Mm.
kinds of crazy stuff. But this playfulness of just kind of entertaining yourself and doing stuff, for me, I have to admit, probably is not as physical as much as it is my desire to do this kind of thing, or to write, or to teach, or communicate. That's where I find my playfulness, where I joke around, where I have fun with people. I still, from a physical standpoint, I love mountain bike riding and hiking and walking, but I don't get to play games that often. Like, I'd love, to be honest with you, if I had a bunch of buddies around who were into playing ball hockey, I'd probably be into playing a little bit of ball hockey.
Mm.
But 60, almost 62 now, your body doesn't necessarily cooperate the same way it did when you were 16.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I'm at 46 already feeling it.
But yeah, it's fun.
No, and I love how you bring up the playfulness aspect of it. One of the things I've been exploring now recently is exactly that. It was funny the other day in the gym where, I'm doing my normal, usual routine. And suddenly now I've been thinking about just play with it, just kind of have fun with it. And don't think of it so much of, because usually I'm in technical mode of like, all right, are my hips back? Am I driving through? Am I thrusting? Now I'm finding I'm like, oh, let me just kind of have some fun while I'm doing
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
So I'm noticing that my body is still doing the movement. It's kind of secondary, but the playfulness is just having fun with it. It's fascinating to explore this and go down this road and start to feel it, where I just notice a different, impact on my body and just overall my spirit
Mhm.
as I'm working out. And what I'm thinking it's going to lead to is definitely just a lighter load. And this is what I'm experimenting on myself right now, that I'd really like to see what this is going to feel like in time
Mhm.
of, where the weights feel almost like lighter at times. Like the bench, when I was doing that,
Okay.
that felt lighter when I was playing with it. And I was like, wow, usually this feels a little bit heavier, but this is interesting that it feels lighter right now as I'm being
Right.
playful.
Right. I love that. Well, and sort of in a different angle to that, my wife Jamie, and when I turned
Mhm.
60 a year and a half ago, she got a whole bunch of friends of mine to create little videos. I think you were one of them actually,
Yeah,
and
no.
sort of these videos to say, "Hey, Scotty, this has been your contribution." And there's one of the guys who's a judoka that I used to train, judo athlete. And I'm kind of notorious when I'm coaching. I have sort of two sides of myself: the serious kind of side that some people call a grizzly bear, and then the other side is kind of playful, stuff. And I often will dance around. I love music, so I will play music
Yeah.
and I'll dance around. And so Antoine kind of wrote this thing like, "Still remember you dancing around while I'm killing myself lifting weights over in the corner, and you enjoying yourself, flopping around the gym, and that's the way I am. Like, I'll be coaching, but then I'll kind of go off into the music and sort of dance around and allow myself to be myself. I think a lot of people don't embrace that when they're doing their job or their work. And for
Yeah.
me, music is joyful, and I try to bring joy to the athletes I coach and have them feel that this isn't just an environment of work, but it's an environment of play and jocularity and having some fun and laughter,
Mm.
etc., and then getting back to work, right?
I love that, brother. I love that. And it kind of segues into as the next part of like, talking about that identity and that transformation you've had, through sport. You've moved through so many chapters, right? As an athlete, therapist, NHL coach, educator, podcast host. I'd love to start by going back to when you first realized that you could design your own path in sport and performance. What was that moment for you specifically?
Well, I don't know if I would describe it as I knew I could design my own path, but I never felt there was anything in the way of it. You know what I mean? So it
Mm,
was kind of like, and this is something that I've noticed after doing my podcast for as long as I have, and in the conversations that I have with people, is it's more common that people circuitously find who they are and what they are over time and through an iterative process than it is
no.
that they knew exactly what they wanted to be and they were going to go and do that. And even the people who do describe that often still have some circuitous, things that happen that sort of segue them some way or a different way or a different direction. I think what I always had a faith in was that I will find my path and it will reveal itself over time, sometimes more trepidatiously than others, where you're kind of feeling a little bit unstable or not sure whether this is going to all work out and stuff. But when I look back at every sort of, call it pivot in my life, many of them were unplanned. Many of them were it just happened to happen that way. And you could go back and look at all these different forks and say, well, what if that fork didn't reveal itself? What would I be doing now? And
Mm,
it actually informs my definition of the term failure. I don't really like the word. And in my personal opinion, I think when you truly fail, it's because something hasn't worked out and you don't learn from it. But in general, when things don't work out, you don't really know whether it was supposed to be that way or not. And you oftentimes, when you look back at when it didn't work out, you can actually trace a path to something that did work out. If I take a simple example, and it's more complex than simple, and at the end of my years in New York with the New York Rangers, I was going through a divorce. I had a car accident. I was released from my contract. I mean, if you looked at this 2-3 month period of my life, in that moment, it was quite psychologically traumatic.
mm,
I remember reading a book by Dr. Phil at one point, and he
mm,
sort of gradiated stress in life, and it was like the highest stressors were divorce, moving, changing
mm,
jobs, and I effectively did all of them. So, where my stress level was, 10 times higher than it should be, so to speak, based
mm,
on those kinds of traumatic experiences going on in my life. So looking at the moment, you go, wow. But what happens off the back of that? I get an opportunity to work for the Montreal Canadiens. I come back to my hometown. I work for 8 years in the league. I meet reconnect with a good friend who becomes my wife of 20 years now. We have a child named Gretchen. So all that doesn't happen. What is the path? Right? So I look back at this kind of idea that, life reveals itself to you. Did I know at some point that I would be what I was going to be? I think I always felt like I could succeed in my professional acumen. And I guess if I really reflect on one moment, it was probably, and I wasn't even aware of it. I was in my second year of university. I never knew what athletic therapy was. In my day, there was no such thing as a strength coach at the level that I was at in Canada. In the States there were, but in Canada there weren't. And so envisioning that as a professional, direction was not even, you couldn't contemplate it because it didn't exist. I was going to become an athletic therapist, and I could tape really well. That was my acumen. And my first mentor, a guy named Gary Cummings, my university prof wasn't going to let me work with the football team of the school because I hadn't done XYZ. And my mentor, Gary Cummings, who was the head therapist of the team, went to him and said, "Fuck that. He's working with me because he's the only guy I knows how to tape."
Yeah.
And it was kind of like this, my acumen meets somebody who believes in me kind of moment, and overcomes somebody who didn't believe in me. Because that guy who said that actually never thought I was going to amount to much in the profession. And then I sort of found my sea legs in that, and then the rest is kind of history. So circuitous way to tell the story, but in some sense, I think that's where it all started in a way.
Well, I love what you touched on right there, and being somebody that's been around the highest of levels for so many years. Talk about that aspect of how many times you've seen through your experience, being decades in the field, of how often that belief from someone else of an idea that they had versus I had the competency of, okay, I'm just going to get in, versus somebody looking at you and going like, oh, you have what I need and I believe in you. Talk about that part as an evolving athlete, where it's like you can speak to that with decades of experience.
Yeah, well, I think that there's the call it the overt and the covert aspect of that, right? Like you can probably point more often to retrospectively understanding that somebody in a covert way was guiding or stewarding you, right? I can't speak to the many times that people grabbed me and said, "You know what, you're good and keep doing this." Right. But I can speak to retrospectively these moments. Like I sat down with my mentor maybe 5 years after I'd gotten certified and I was working, and he told me the story of him walking into that room and saying, "No, Scotty's got to work with me." I didn't know that.
Right.
But what I knew was there was an energy in my mentor, Gary, that he had my back and that he believed in me, right? And he supported what I wanted to do and where I wanted to go. And he was actually the same guy who reached out to me when I was struggling to find a job and said, "Hey, why don't you come over and work for us?" So he always kind of looked out for me. And I can look back at multiple people over time. Again, I was about to leave the profession of, so if I segue back to 89, 90, I had become a certified AT, had just done my certification as a strength coach, and I couldn't find a job. There really wasn't much going on. It was a tenuous time, and I had actually started managing a sports store to make some money. And I was truly contemplating just getting out of this thing. I grew up in Ottawa. I was living in Montreal. I wasn't Francophone. I did speak French, but I was like, well, maybe I'll just go back to Ottawa and do something else. And another mentor of mine, who happened to be the head therapist at the university at the time, and he'd only been there 4 or 5 years, walks into the sports store with his wife, kind of to look at jackets and stuff, and starts telling me he's about to hire an assistant therapist. And I said to him, well, and I was actually counseling him on the people I thought would be worthy of the position. And then I said to him, you know what? Have you ever thought we could do something where I'm the strength coach and therapist? And he was like, that's a cool idea. I like that idea. And so he was able to muster up $5,000 from the university to pay me. And then because I could leave the job and be on unemployment insurance there's the only time in my life I went on unemployment insurance. I went on unemployment insurance for the year. So I was collecting insurance. Don't get me
Yeah.
Revenue Canada now.
Rule to
And I was
change, rule to
making
change.
$5,000 at Concordia to work.
Mm.
And that was the start of a professional career, right? But if he doesn't walk into that space and think I'm worthy of being with him. So as I look back into your question, I think that these things, they're often what we feel and not what we know for sure, right? And I think, you and I have had discussions, and we're probably going to break out into that about, the room and a team and people feeling like this is the right room and the right team and the success. It's not always in what's said. It's what is done and
Right.
what actions occur that make you feel safe, make you feel supported, make you feel that somebody's got your back.
Right.
And I look back at my mentors, and when you share who are your mentors, oftentimes the attributes of your mentors are that somewhere, somehow they had your back, somewhere, somehow they made sure everything was okay. And maybe it was just because they got out of the way, or
Right.
they gave you space, or they let you fail and picked you back up, all those kinds of things.
Yeah. Amen. I love how that's kind of how, you noticed, right? That covert of just understanding, dealing with the unknown, right? And the known parts of it that, like you said, we can feel it. And there's a sensitivity for sure to a high performer where you just start to know, right? There's the it factor. That person has or they don't kind of thing. Like you develop that when you're just around it for so long. That's one of the things I respect so much about your process and the chance you took, right? Where you left the NHL at the peak of your career, which is rare. Like, it's like you're killing it and you're like, all right, I'm going on my own, right? And so this is that kind of like other side where you bet on yourself, where it's not just somebody else betting on you now, it's like betting yourself. So, how did you work through that identity shift, from being the guy in the league and, to stepping into the unknown, which is just fascinating to me.
Yeah, it's funny. My wife always says to me, you have like this 7-year itch. Every 7 years, I kind of go, oh, I need to do something different. But
Rhythms and cycles.
It's funny, but I always recognized in me that I was not, say, a hockey guy or a football guy, or I enjoy sport, and I enjoy the act of helping other people to get better at what they need to be better at.
Yeah.
And imparting whatever wisdom I've accumulated and whatever skills or knowledge I've accumulated. I've always enjoyed sharing that. And so, and the other thing that I like, my purpose as written now is to create change, challenge convention, and inspire others through my own actions so that they can be a better version of themselves. That's my purpose statement. So whether, again, consciously or unconsciously, I was always filtering and evaluating my circumstances based on my ability to do those things. So if I look back, and this is kind of how I try to steward this in my own mentorship of people, is you start to recognize what are the things that you gravitate towards or resonate within you that you keep hearing, and sometimes you push away because of the circumstances, but then you start to realize this is more where I should be, right? So as I'm working my way through the NHL, I'm recognizing that part of me wanted that because I felt like my ego felt like that was where I needed to be, or what I needed to do in order to reach the pinnacle, or be respected, or be understood, or be able to, impart more to others. So to be able to create an action to what I wanted to do, being in that pinnacle space was the place to be. But once I was there, what I started to notice was that I couldn't create change quite the way I wanted to. I couldn't challenge convention quite the way
Right.
I wanted to.
Mm.
I couldn't necessarily externally inspire, because a lot of what you do is kind of, it's poo-pooed in some sense to kind of to broadcast what you're doing, because it's kind of like, well, these are all our internal secrets to our success, right? So a lot of what I was doing was going against who I really was. And so you start to feel this internal dissonance. And that's what I felt when I was there. When I would have the dissatisfactory conversations with Jamie or with some friend or just with myself, the recognition always came back to, you're not necessarily being true to who you are.
Right.
And over time, I recognized that more and more. And that's when sort of I made a decision at the time that I had an opportunity external of pro hockey to do more of what I wanted to do. This new opportunity allowed me to craft something, to create, to challenge convention, to do these things in the operating paradigm I was going to walk into. So it was a natural segue for me, simply because I was living more of my internal truth.
Mm.
That being said, like when you and I first met each other, I was still, I guess, internally fighting with knowing that. It was a subconscious understanding, but not a conscious understanding. And I think the mindset work that I did, that you in turn also did, was the revelation for me, from shifting it from subconscious to a conscious understanding of, this is who I am. So therefore I should be filtering things with this thought process rather than ignoring it or fighting it.
Right.
I don't know if that makes sense, but
No, 100%. You nailed it. And I think that's one of the things that's so interesting as you evolve as an athlete, is that, the conditions of the environment, like you said, it's, we're a part of it, of these high performing fields, because we're drawn to it. We want to be around the best, and we want to show that I can be there. But then the irony is, while you're there, you get restricted. Like, am I really allowed to be me? And this is always the challenge, right? Is like finding your way. And unfortunately, most of the systems to this day are not designed to allow you to be you. You have to conform. We're going to tell you how to be. And everything we know about high performing nature, the autonomy that people need in general, right? It's fascinating to me how challenging that is for the system that is designed through that nature of like, okay, we are high level athletics and this is what it's all about. And yet all the research points towards the autonomy, right? Being able to have your own voice, have that freedom to feel like you belong. And we don't take that. And that's the part that's fascinating to me, because there's opportunity, like you brought up there, of where, that transferable skill is where, I always appreciate that by going through those challenges on our own ultimately and trying to figure it out for ourselves, and then becoming conscious of just who we are in our own vehicle, just how powerful that is for our own confidence, for our own belief system as we move forward, and the wisdom, right, that we build from it.
right.
And that's what I love about, like with you, right, is that you've worked, right, in every conceivable performance environment, college, pro Olympic, now you're doing global mentorship. Talk about that aspect of the process of where, what skills did you carry from the ice into the classroom and the podcast studio? What are those skill sets now that you look at and you're like, this is what I learned so far through the journey that's now transferring into the other parts of my life currently?
Yeah, that's it's got a lot of dimensions to it in terms of the question, but I think this is something, again, you and I have talked about before, but maybe not in this necessarily this way, is that I think when, like you're in mental performance, and I've observed practitioners in that world for a long time and people in my world. And I think where I see the ones that fail to be as good as they could be is usually because they talk to the athlete rather than with the athlete, or listen to the athlete and understand
Mhm.
the athlete. And it's the same thing in my industry. I
Mhm.
tell them how to train versus understand what their problem is and what they're struggling with. And it's a very sort of fine line between coaching, teaching, and listening. But the ones that are really good at it are recognize that listening comes first, understanding comes first, gathering information comes first. Then you start to use your book of skills to nurture what it is that person needs, versus saying, this is my book of skills, I'm going to deliver them to you. So you have to find this, and this is still something I'm learning all the time. And it's funny how it resonates into everything that we do that we're not aware of, right? Yesterday I had on my podcast a friend of mine that I met. He's like really good sales guy. Like, he's written a book on sales and how to do it. He reached out to me a few years ago and asked me if I would coach his daughter, who's a up and coming mogul skier, because he'd seen all these videos that I was doing with one of the mogul skier athletes that I was doing. So I went down, met him in Colorado, stayed friends and connected. And so yesterday I had him on him. I was just talking to him. I said, life at the end of the day is really about us selling all the time. We're selling the information that we have, and hopefully the person in front of us will acquire it because
Mhm.
to make themselves better. But I said, what's the main mistake most people make in sales? And he goes, the biggest mistake is people don't understand what the person's problem is and meet them where they are. They try to sell them what they have.
Exactly.
And that's exactly what I'm talking about. Like, it's that difference between,
Mm.
and this is what frustrates me about my brethren in my industry, is everybody gets all bent out of shape about you trying to sell something, or that you're marketing your, skills or attributes or whatever you're doing. And so everybody walks around saying, well, we should be quiet. It should be holding our secrets. We shouldn't be talking to people, da, 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 da.
Mhm. There we go.
Ultimately, what you're doing every day when you walk into the gym or when you walk into working in a mental preparation situation is you're going to sell somebody something, but there's the way of pushing it because you believe it, and then there's the way of understanding their problem and saying, this is my set of tools. Here's a few that might help you. Do you want to learn about them? Right? And so over time, what I've cultivated, I think, better and better. And part of the reason why I started podcasting was not only because it resonated in my heart, but my goal with it was to become a better listener, more curious, learn to ask better questions. I always felt I did that relatively well, but I tended to share my opinion more forcefully early on in my relationships, and then come back to the learning portion. And what I've
Mhm.
recognized now in myself is I have to be more of a learner and curious and interested and create that rapport, and then provide the food the person needs at the time, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Now that it's funny when bring up the sales piece, right? Of like, one of the things that I've had a few people say, you'd be really good at sales. I just would laugh at them. I'm like, why? Because you believe what I'm saying? I'm
Mm.
like, no, like it has nothing to do with, I'm not trying to sell you anything. I have some truths that I believe in and I just share them with you.
Now,
Now, whether or not you're saying you think, oh, I'd be great. Someone else hears these same truths and they're gonna be like, this guy's maniac, he's crazy. So to each his own. But to your point, right? Getting to that place and finding it, that's the challenge I think we all have. And
right.
that's one of the things I've always loved about your ability is, thinking in kind of like that recipe format, right? Like your reconditioning system, it blends therapy, neurology, performance, and you bring these worlds together. Talk about how, your professional experience and all these experiences that you had, right, have shaped the way that you teach and have blended that integration today.
Mm.
Like, well, how's that? Because like you said, the learner, like you understand yourself enough to pivot on that, but at the same time, you're such a chef. Like you're so good at like, how do I put these together? And, oh, what kind of meal you want? I got it ready for you. Here we go.
Again, I think it's funny that you compare it to cooking. I think the way my life has revealed itself is if I use cooking as an example, is I played a lot with food and cooked a lot and tried a lot of stuff and found and made my mistakes and became good at cooking. And then and chefing, so to speak, and serving the crowd appropriately. And then I learned all the science and the structure and the process to underpin it better and understand why it was actually happening not so much in the back, but through the background of all of this. And so now what I've kind of come to this recognition point through my process is, when it comes to the human body, it's really interesting. Neurology, and this is why I got into neurology 4 or 5 years ago, and it's become even more obvious to me recently, is your neurological system is in charge of what you do. Like, it is the governing system of your body. Your brain is number one. It is processing information and deciding what you're going to do, and it keeps you alive. As soon as you cut off the blood flow to it, you're dead, right? So let's all just understand that your brain's in charge. So when we understand that, then the way your brain works in a simplistic way is that it's receiving inputs all the time. It's interpreting those inputs and integrating those inputs to make decisions. What does it want to do? Sit on a couch and watch a football game? Or does it want to get up and create action and activity and move? Okay. So it's deciding what it wants to do all the time, every second of every day. And that creates outputs. Outputs are what we observe. Outputs are what we feel. Outputs are what we say. So you and I learned this concept around the, bound nature and the symptoms of bound nature. So thoughts, actions, behaviors, symptoms. Okay. Those are all outputs. So actions, I move, that's an output of my body. Thoughts, I think about something positive or I think about something negative, right? These are all things that are being created by our brain. Our brain creates that information. Our brain creates pain. Our brain creates all the stuff that we feel. It is creating meaning. Otherwise, we don't have meaning. Okay.
Exactly.
So meaning is created in our brain, and our brain creates that meaning principally because it works from the perspective of prediction. It has to predict because it has to be safe. So at the center of our function is we have kind of two minds. We have our lizard mind that was here since millennia, that effectively its job is to keep us alive. Because if we're not alive, we're not doing what we want to do, right? And then we have our cortical mind, or our thinking mind, that is what's created all the cool things that we look at, going to space, we can contemplate the contemplation of our contemplation, right? So it's the thinking machine, right? Those two brains are working together all the time. And that survival mind is the primary mind in the terms of protecting us, right? So everything we see, we interpret, we understand is based on our brain's way of perceiving information, which is predictive. So how does it predict? It predicts based on fundamentally on two things: experience, or what it's been told over time. So when you're a kid, when you're a baby, you're walking around as a toddler, who tells you not to stick your finger in the electrical socket? Mom and dad, right? Our parents influence us. Depending on how we grew up, our parents influence us in many positive ways, and perhaps they influence us in many negative ways. And then we have experiences. We're a kid, we get bitten by a dog, now we're fearful of dogs. All these things happen. They layer into how we perceive information, right? I tell this story all to understand that you can't think your physiology. So when it comes to psychology, the movement, acquisition, etc., we first and foremost have to understand that the system works on input, interpretation, integration, output. So if I see my athlete is stressed, wound up, anxious, etc., those are all outputs. What's creating the threat? Do I understand that? So telling him what to do and using a series of emotive skills is one part of that equation. But unless you understand what creates the threat, you're just actioning towards outputs. It's the same thing in a strength conditioning perspective. If my athlete is not moving properly or loading properly, and I use cueing or direction or constraint to change that, yes, I will get change, but I'm principally focusing on outputs. I still don't understand what's driving the integration and decision-making tree that's not working properly. So if I really want to create solutions, I have to understand that loop, and I have to intervene in that loop appropriately. So this is, a short Coles Notes version of what I've come to understand over time. And that has drawn me to understand that what you do professionally, what I do professionally are synonymous. They are not disparate.
Exactly. Bingo.
And people make the mistake of making them disparate. Oh, he's the mental prep guy. He's got the black box. Let him take care of that. I've got the physical box over here. No, you're both working the same thing. What are the problems? How do we address them, right?
Yeah, nailed it. And, the one thing that I love that you articulated so beautifully is exactly that, of where there is no difference between, like, this idea of mental is separate from the physical. And you nailed it of, this is something I was battling with over the last couple of years. And there's been little segments that have revealed themselves to me. And you're right, the nervous system work. I recently did some nervous system reset, over at Dr. Sean Drake's place, which was amazing stuff. We can get into it another time. But, the thing about the nervous system part is, it's all based from the physical. And something that's come out recently that I've been teaching the younger minds, because you're always, like all of us, we're trying to battle. How do we help 13, 14, 15-year-olds start to just receive exposure to these ideas? What does that actually mean, mental performance or mindset or anything like that? And one of the things that's come up in an exercise that I've been doing is body intelligence. And so what I do is I have them do a visualization routine where what they're doing is they're showing whoever they're participating with, show them what you're going to do, but you can't use your voice. You can't tell them, but you're going to show them. And they have to read off of your body language, and then reverse. You have to read off of their body language. But basically the idea is that we're going to learn body intelligence. We're going to look and read off of the body, which in hockey, they talk about reading and reacting all the time. Right. But how often do we teach, what? No communication, no talking, no words that are going to guide me, cues. The only cue is read the body. Read the body language. What do you notice? What do you see? What looks efficient? What doesn't? What can you take off of a little deception? I'll go here. What can we do by just quiet and just read off of each other's body intelligence? And you nailed that beautifully of that's one of the biggest parts that, I've realized through the work, mindset work of like, no, they're both together. That's something we deal with now in the off season. Hey, no man steps in the same river twice. You're about to go April, you finished May, you finished your season. When September rolls around, everything you thought you were getting better at and what you're preparing for, you're not the same person anymore. You've literally changed. So with that change now is you've got to update the software. Right. What you thought you were turning into, you may be way better now and you don't even realize it. So now you've got to go through that experience again, feel it, and recognize and update the software with what's actually here now, not with who you were before. And so much of it is from that physical sensation of what just happened.
No, love it. Yeah. It's funny, in mentoring a lot of people in human performance, it's crazy how often we're always imparting to people this idea of assess, program, reassess. Like, did the program you deliver create the output expressions you wanted and the adaptations you were looking for, right? That's what we teach in human performance. But then all these people don't do that with their own psychological and sociological lives.
Exactly.
They don't say, okay, I'm going to do this stuff. How has it changed me? Now I revise the program to move forward. It's always, in the moment, I'm stressed out, I'm worn out, They don't think about the back of where they've come from. So we learned in the mentorship, minding the gap. Where have you come from? Where are you now? What do
Exactly.
you want to intentionally create moving forward? It's all
Mm-hmm.
about backwards to understand where you are, forwards to understand where you want to go, presence to be in the now, right?
Yeah. Amen.
It's simple shit that we don't want to lean into sometimes because it seems too simple, but at the end of the
That's
day,
it.
it is.
That's it. Right. Like, you remember the formula, like I kind of revised it, to adapt to our nature, but simplicity plus consistency equals sustainability.
Yeah.
I forget what the original simplicity was. If simplicity plus consistency equals, do you remember like, what it was originally?
I don't
I
remember.
forget what it came, but basically sustainability was like, but the simplicity part, right? This is what we teach our players all the time, is that simplicity part is actually complex because you're the only one that knows the answer to simplicity, right? It's the old Bruce Lee quote, I fear not the man who's practiced 10,000 kicks once. I fear the man who's practiced one kick 10,000 times. But figuring out what that one kick, that simplicity, okay, here's the thing I should focus in on. That is unique to your own preference. Like, that is only something that can be revealed to you because I'm in my vehicle. Nobody else can tell me what it feels like to be in my body, in my spirit, in my soul, and say, you should be doing this. When it's like, yeah, but I feel like something's telling me I should go do this. And well, you're crazy to think that. Am I? Because you're putting your bias, your distortions on me of what you believe. But how do you know that what I believe isn't the truth of what I need to do?
Well,
And that's so much of what, I think the challenges are for us, right? On that end, as, performance coaches, that so many times we fail to recognize that there's a duality to this whole thing,
yeah.
where there's your version and my version. And like you said earlier, we have to work together on bringing that together, not being the expert. We have to be the guides. Right? That's motivational interviewing of like, we've got to guide it and go, I'm participating with you. Let's do this together. As opposed to, well, no, I'm the authority. I know what's best for you.
Right.
Which just isn't the reality.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'd be interested in your viewpoint on this, but this always seems to be the challenging conversation around whether you work with somebody's strengths or you identify their weaknesses and try to correct them in some sense.
Yep.
One of the things that I've tried to re-identify is the term weakness, and what I bring relevance to it in is using the language deficit. So I look at a series of weaknesses that somebody might have and strengths, but a deficit is a weakness that somebody needs that acumen or attribute in order to create success in what they do. So then that becomes something that may or may not, depending on the circumstances, need to be addressed, right? So a simple example would be if, let's say, I'm a diver and I have a low aerobic capacity, that may or may not be important to the sport that I'm performing. And so that's a weakness, but maybe not a deficit. But contextually, what I don't understand when I look at diving is that if they do 10-meter diving, they actually have to walk up a series of 75 stairs every time they want to do it. So maybe they do need an aerobic capacity, right? So you have to look at every set of circumstances, recognize whether these things are matter or not. Then the question comes back, and you and I have talked about this, in an organizational framework, is recognizing what are the systems, practices, strategies, culture you want to have?
Right.
And does this individual, with the attributes they have, the strengths they have, do they fit into that cultural mosaic or not? If they don't, well, then why are you trying to force a round peg into a square hole, or vice versa? Maybe there's somebody you should trade or change or exchange for somebody else who has those attributes. So my experience has been that the great teams try to draft and acquire athletes that have a set of skills and attributes and character traits that are within a scope or framework of how they operate, so that they're not having to reinvent these people or force them to be something they're not, right? But then once you're in that space or that environment, to your point earlier, is when you're a good coach, is you're a way to find how that person's strengths or abilities or character traits bring out the best in everybody else.
Exactly.
So can their joy or their intensity or their thoughtfulness or their intellect lean into and wipe off on other people so that everybody feels empowered by this person rather than overcome by them or what have you, you know?
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Yeah, and what you're bringing up. So in our mindset method recipe, right, one of our ingredients is we call it identify strengths and challenges. And the reason we bring that up is because we want the athletes to become aware of the duality, right? So it's duality of whatever sport, take your pick. But let's use an example of duality of hockey, right? In order to know how to win, you have to know how to lose, right? There's a home and away energy. In order to understand positivity, you have to understand negativity. In order to understand love, you have to understand hate. So there's always a duality to the nature. So when we raise the level is, okay, you've got to understand duality of there's things you're strong at, right? And there's things that are challenging for you. And you have to be able to look at them fairly. And this is the paradox that's always fascinated me about the two worlds. Every single athlete we talk, NHL all the way down, we ask them the same question of like, you ever find it fascinating how when we ask what your strengths are, how there's very little confidence. You're like shy and humble and, oh, I'm good at this. And right. But when we ask what your weaknesses or your challenges are, you're super confident. And I look at I'm like, what is that? Why is it I can tell you with confidence, here's what I'm brutal at, but what I'm good at, it feels kind of weird, right? The nature versus nurture aspect. So to your point, that's one of the things we raise awareness to is the duality, and then you consider it. So in a simple example of hockey players, right, it might be something where, hey, your defensive zone is just not that great. You got to get better in the D zone. You got to get better in the D zone. We've got to make that better. How you put your stick on puck, whatever it might be in that situation. Well, the reality is, but this same player is unbelievable at getting pucks up the ice. They've got this strength that's like, wow, you are really good at getting pucks out and up. Your first pass is amazing. So the argument I made for years is, well, okay, so if they're not great in the zone on that skill set, but what if we raise the consciousness of, well, then how do I get the puck back so I can get it out faster? How do I get it up quicker? Because now you've solved the problem. You've taken what's quote unquote weak or challenging, and you've elevated the ability to recognize and go, you know what? Yeah, I am really good at getting pucks out. So how do I do that more often? And then boom, that deficit part that you're talking about, right? It takes the balancing act and says, well, if I do more of this, does that fix this?
Great.
And I think that's something that we rarely take a look at is we get so honed in on the okay, you're weak at that. Okay, I just look at that. But what are you really good at? That if we raise that in the experience, because it is a game, right? And there's infinite possibilities. We all know it. There's 1,000 ways to score a goal. There's not just the one way, even though some people think it. All right. But the reality is like, all right, what am I doing in terms of what I know is quote unquote weak or challenging or negative, and looking at my nature and going, but I'm really good at that. And that could actually offset my weakness if I did more of what this strength is.
Yeah, I love that.
It's
interesting listening to you talk about that. And I really like that application. One of the questions I would have for you that's always been a question in my own space is, when we don't want to do something because we don't either think we're good at it or we don't like it, my question is always, is it because it doesn't resonate within us for what I would call reasonable reasons, i.e., let's say, for example, I'll use my own example. Like I have tried water skiing before, but and I wasn't very good at it. It took me a while to get up, but once I got up, I could do it, and I could. But it didn't resonate within me. I didn't go, "Oh, I really like the feeling of this. This is exciting." Da, da, da. Whereas my wife Jamie loves it. She loves the feeling. She loves the energetics of it, right? Whereas I might avoid it because I fear being looking foolish, looking stupid, or had a bad experience at some point. So if we segue back, I fell, crashed, people laughed at me when I was a kid. I don't want to do that anymore, etc. So what's the background noise in the creation of my viewpoint of that skill or that thing that I need to do? So you take your example. If you've got a player who's maybe not good in the corners, maybe their first pass is great, but their retrieval is weak.
Mm-hmm.
Well, do we understand why? Well,
Right.
did a coach back in Pee Wee tell them that they're not good at it, and so then they just believe that? Okay. Did they go in the corner and somebody crucified them in the corner and crushed them, and they were
Mm-hmm.
injured for 6 weeks because of it? And so ever
Yep.
since, it's been a scary proposition for them to do that. So we go
Mm-hmm.
back to that neurology. What's the neurology creating in terms of threat that makes them feel challenged for doing that? And so therefore, they are not good at it, right? So it's trying to unpeel, and this doesn't happen in 5 seconds or less. That's
Exactly.
why all of this stuff is about a patience game, right?
Bingo.
But as you're trying to make a better defenseman and saying, here are some of the skills they do well, it's recognizing if they say, well, I'm not good at going in the corners, or I don't feel good in the corners, you can accept that. And to your point, strengthen that strength, that first pass. Once you've got it, make that great first pass. But in order to solve that what I would call powerful equation, i.e. puck retrieval, confidence, turning up the ice, and then making the first pass, that's an equation, right? That makes you an even better defenseman.
Exactly.
Yes, you make a great first pass, but you're not getting the puck out of the corner. That can be problematic. It might stop you from going from the AHL to the NHL. It might stop you from being a third line defenseman to a first line defenseman. Example. So if I want to change that, I have to dig into when did they start to believe they weren't good at it, and is there any historical context to that, and how can we take that away or clear the mechanism of that to give them that confidence and reduce that threat, so now they can go into the corner with a little bit more sense of themselves rather than a belief that's been conspired by a bunch of different circumstances, right?
Yep. You nailed it. And there's multiple layers, right? And this is just kind of like a generalization, right, of what we've seen with that exact process and how we kind of, bring the players through it. But the idea is, number one, the story, identifying what is the narrative that you actually have about that, and just own it. Know, like, okay, this is the narrative that I have, right? The tripod exercise, right? Like, okay, let's break it down and go, is this real or not? And how can we make it where it's not 100%? How can we make it so you kind of realize, like, okay, this isn't 100% truth. So when you start to break that down, right, and this is the biggest thing, and this comes to the other point of what I found a lot of success with is helping people understand what's good enough. As high performers, we become very hyper obsessed with, I've got to be great at it. I've got to be amazing at everything. And when you bring the recipe back, no, it's a synergy. There's some things and skills that you just have to be good enough. There's tons of players at professional levels that are just good enough at certain skills. They're not great, but they have other skill sets that they're amazing at. And the synergy of those ingredients together is what makes them a great or an amazing athlete. So that mindset, that mental piece, that clarity of knowing, okay, it's enough. I don't have to keep hyper obsessing to get better at defending. That, okay, if I just make this play and I do it consistently enough, it's good enough. It'll keep me out of quote unquote trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where the story gets challenging, where how often do we play with that mechanism in our own state of mind and realize it's good enough? Because for every high performer, high achiever, that's the hardest part is, well, I can do more. No one's saying you couldn't do more, but is it necessary with the experience and the reality and the amount of stress you're going to deal with? Do you need to do any more than is necessary?
Right.
Or is this enough to get you what you want, back to getting pucks out or whatever it is, whatever you need to do, right? Where it's like, okay, this is enough. Okay, I'm out there water skiing. It's enough. This is good enough for me to enjoy myself. Nice slow speed. I don't need to be fast. I'm going to go at my tempo.
Right.
And are you okay with that perspective where it's good enough? And I find that's what's challenging for a lot of high performers is, but no, I can be great at it.
Yes.
And that's the challenge is, but you don't have to be to enjoy it.
Well, I agree with you. And the other side of that coin, which I think is really powerful, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, is how much do you identify with your strengths? Like,
No.
I think the identity side, and you asked me this question earlier about how my identity has been crafted over time.
Mm-hmm.
And I opened with saying I was a football player,
Right.
and then I was an athletic therapist, and then I was an athletic therapist and strength coach, and then I was a hockey guy, and then I
Mhm.
was an Olympic guy, and da 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 da. And that was external perceptive
Right.
identification of me. But the funny thing is now, like if you say, Scotty, what do you do for a living? I can't really describe it other than that it comes back to my purpose.
Right.
This is what I do for a living.
Yep.
So that's again the process of when we look at our athletes is recognizing that their identity gives them strength and in many cases a sense of confidence in especially in the early stages of their career.
Mhm.
But if they're going to be great, and this is my personal opinion, but if they're going to be great, they need to understand that that identity is not who they are. It is just part of who they express themselves are, and there are
Right.
many other aspects to who they are, and that's going to be perhaps being a father one day, or
Mm.
a mother. Perhaps that's going to be an entrepreneur. Perhaps that's going to be, and so the less we over identify with I'm trying to find the right words. What we want to try to do over the course of a professional or performance athlete's career, if we're given the ability to interface with them, is to slowly but surely disconnect them from that identity in the sense that it is a negative and just let it be a positive on its own.
Yep.
By giving them permission to explore other aspects of who they are. And the
Yes.
more that we do that, then the less when they have a momentary crisis of
Mhm.
success, their world doesn't fall apart. So as an example, if my identity is I'm the great first line defenseman who can make the great first pass, and I break my wrist and I no longer have the same touch on my puck, does that mean I'm no longer any good to anybody?
Mm.
No, because I'm still a good dad and I'm still a good teammate and I'm still a good this and I'm still a good that. But if everything's been focused on me being the great first line defenseman who can make the great first pass and make the big slap shot from the point, and now my wrist isn't letting me do that anymore, who am I now?
Mm.
That's, to me, is an exceptionally important part of the equation.
Huge, huge. And it's, yeah, and the biggest part, right? And this is where we talk about that identity, like we said earlier, right? Is when you give cues. It's kind of like the same version, right? In a different way, in a relatable way, where I get a cue and I feel like this is what is exactly, I take it to the T, right? Like looking at the cookbook versus being a chef. And I look at the cookbook and it says I need a teaspoon of sugar. You put a teaspoon and a half. What are you doing?
Yeah.
Right. And that's what happens is the identity is because it's clear, it's known, it's okay, follow the exact rules, right? We know the brain, habit, structure. We enjoy that part. Just give me the answer, make me feel at ease, make me feel safe. But then there's this other aspect where it's risky betting on yourself. It's risky knowing your vehicle and how you're operating and going into that. And you actually segued it beautifully into balance. And that's something that, I know you've worked a lot on, that you've worked on through the years, right? Is like not just how we're training athletes, but, how we live and evolve, right?
Mhm.
Ourselves. And so, you've been a part of, and you've been pretty open, right, about how chasing that professional success early on sometimes came at the cost, of personal relationships for you. What did you have to unlearn about winning to find real balance?
Well,
Because this is a big part of kind of comes back to what you're just talking about is like, that's our biggest challenge, right? Is like that we have to unlearn these other ways of thinking and we have to recognize in ourselves, like, wait, this is the way I see it. This is the way I learn it. So for you personally, what do you feel, what did you notice that you had to unlearn about the winning to find that real balance that's led you to understanding this perspective?
yeah, it's a great question. I think it's fundamentally, and it's a bit cliche at this point because so many people talk about it, but it's this idea of focusing on the process and not on the outcome at the end of the day. And has become cliche because people don't really recognize what that truly means in some sense. And I think we were talking about it earlier, is if I'm focused on the process, I recognize that life is an iterative process. I'm always reinventing myself and relearning about, and I am never a finished product. And so I think the biggest revelation I had in my life was when I recognized that I will never arrive. There will never be a place of arrival. I will always be on this journey until such time as it is taken away from me. So when you accept that you're always in that reiterative or iterative process, then going back to what I said before, you call it minding the gap or looking back or your history or your experiences as a reflection point of how have I grown? Who am I now? How have I changed? Self-reflection, in my viewpoint, is not woo-woo, wah-wah. It's just about you understanding who you have become. You now are this person, not the person you were 20 years ago. You were no longer the things you feared then, you no longer fear because of these different experiences. Now you're here. How are you present in your experiences now such that you feel them? The five senses are being explored. You're smelling, you're tasting, you're hearing, you're listening, you're exposing, in that, so that it creates an internal feeling of and sensation of life, of joy, of suffering sometimes. So you are present in that, so that it then creates a mechanism for you to investigate what you really want, which is that intentional future aspiration. But that intentional future aspiration is not based on a golden carrot or the gold medal, the win of the Super Bowl. It's based on who you want to be and how you want to feel as you move forward. So you can want to win the Super Bowl, you can want to win a gold medal, but if everything is based on that being the success output, then I was watching the series Quarterback the other day, and at the end of the day, only one quarterback wins every year, and the other 31 don't. Right? So, are they all failures? Are they all losers? No, because they've created a life that is way more meaningful than simply winning the Super Bowl. So, at the end of the day, that is kind of the golden egg, but the real joy comes from your relational experiences in working together towards creating that, the people you work with. So coming back to your presence, the key is, are you experiencing now what it is you want to experience in reaching towards that aspiration? The problem is most people keep looking over, oh, I got to get there. And they're not experiencing this. And then when they start to experience this, they go back and go, well, how come I didn't do this? And I didn't do that. And I failed at this instead of being here. So the art of living, call it balance. People suffer with this language of balance because they think of it as a scale. I like to think of it more as like a mixing board and sound board, where you're putting up the mid-range a little bit, bringing the treble up, bringing the bass, depending on the circumstances and situation. But are you in the experience of the moment? If I look at this podcast as an example, you ask me to come and speak to you. I am present in this conversation, listening to what you say to me, finding things that I feel I can bring to the conversation. I'm not sitting over here going, okay, I have to say this, and I have to say this, and I have to say this. If Vinny asks me this, I do this, and this podcast has to really have lots of viewership, and what if it doesn't? And I don't have any of that bullshit in the background.
Right.
I'm simply having a conversation. I'm feeling what it is you ask me, and then I'm talking about what it is I understand and bringing that across. That's presence, right?
I love that. What's a real world example you can share, whether as husband, father, professional, of where you've changed, that perspective of where you thought one way at one point, and then you found that balance, and now it's completely shifted. And it was like, there was an aha moment for you through that experience.
It's a great question. I would say, early on in being a dad, I think I wanted to try to control everything about being what my daughter was going to experience or live through, right?
Mm.
And as I've gotten a little bit older and a little bit wiser over time, I've kind of come to recognize that I need to, my job as a father is to make sure my daughter's safe as best I can and act as a steward of her experiences, almost like a mirror to provide some thought or perspective, but not to tell her yes or no. So I'll give you a couple examples. One is my daughter, when she was probably about 12 or 13, wanted to put purple color in her hair. The conventional father in me would say, well, it's not the color in her hair. Why ain't she going to do that? No, you can't put color in your hair. Why not red? Yeah. Instead, I was like, oh, cool. Put it in, do it. And so it was a phase. My daughter likes to wear T-shirts with a cutoff. You see her belly button. Some fathers like, no, that's never going to happen. You're not wearing that kind of shirt. I'm like, whatever, wear it. It's not going to change the world. And so by doing that, she becomes comfortable. She is always comfortable with who she is. And she goes through the phase of trying it, doing it, seeing if it gets a rise out of dad or not. And most recently, she's had her first boyfriend and, comes in the front door. She's at camp and, Dad, I have a boyfriend. And waiting for that reaction of, gruff or whatever, or rough. And I've come to realize that I just simply want to hear her experience. What I want to make sure is that this man or person that she's with is treating her with respect and care. And if that's good, then the laughter they have, the jokes they tell, the way she is, that's all her business to explore, right? Yeah. I just have to make sure she's safe. And if she's safe, then the rest is her business to explore, right? So that takes, I don't know if I would have been that father 20 years ago,
Right.
I had her at 45 instead of at 30 or 35. I think at 30 or 35, I might have tried to be a little bit more kind of, no, you can't do that. And no, this isn't going to work. And so recognition that we all have to experience our experiences and be ourselves. And I, not to belabor it too much, but I think I'm proud of the father I am because the daughter I have, I believe she is herself, like my daughter doesn't fake it or pretend, or she's just who she is, and that to me is the most beautiful thing about being a dad is that my daughter is is her true natural persona rather than trying to be somebody she needs to be because dad needs her to be this or her friends need her to be this or whatever,
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's one of the things that I love the most about, the journey of being an evolving athlete, right? Is like, we're always colliding those worlds of personal, right? I'm learning from there. And then there's my professional life, right? That duality, if you will, right? And it's always being able to take the lessons from both worlds and they just continue going back and forth with one another. And so that's what I love about that part, right? Of like, it's recognizing like, yeah, this is in one way who I was back in the day, right? Because there's plenty of people, they knew me from 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I got one guy that was just like, Vinny Malts, a mental guy now? He used to be a mental midget. And it's all perspective, right? Of like, they remember me from like once or twice of seeing me. And it's like, boom, they already know my whole life on that part, right? Whereas on the journey, as you evolve, we're always learning, right? We're always taking away these little experiences. And so from a fatherhood, right, of like being able to recognize that development in yourself and then to say, back then I don't think I would have been like it, but I've grown, I've seen it differently now. That's one of the things that I love about so much about the journey aspect of it. And so hearing you talk about, that balancing part of it, right? And then just thinking about the legacy that you're building, right? That what you're looking to leave behind. And so, talk about, how with reconditioning HQ, because I love the work that you do and how you've molded, right, and brought together unique recipe. What gap in the industry were you trying to close when you created it? When you sense like, all right, something has to shift, right? What is it that you felt like you were solving for when you created of that gap that you saw?
Well, I'll tell one story not to answer your question back to what you just finished saying, which was I just finished watching the Netflix series Quarterback, and I wrote a blog about it this week. And what was most profound for me watching that was it really resonated with the conversation we've been having up until now. When I watched these guys and I watched the previous series, the thing that struck me most is how genuine these men are. They are all successful. I mean, to be an NFL quarterback is, not an easy thing to do.
Right.
And you're not all going to win Super Bowls, but to be the best of the best at what you do, you have to, at the end of the day, and this is what I think younger people should resonate in watching it, is you still need to treat people with respect and kindness. You still have to work hard at what you do. You still have to find an inner belief in the things that are your strengths, etc. And when you watch these guys carry themselves, they're good human beings. That's why they're successful, not just that they're great quarterbacks, right? So I wanted to put a pin on that because I think when you have a chance, these different series to watch are really valuable sometimes, because 9 times out of 10 you get to see the best of humanity. Occasionally you're going to see the narcissistic bad example of athlete or character, which exist, and they exist in society. But most of the time, there are guys like these guys are, a Kirk Cousins who, is just a good character human being,
Right.
Joe Burrow, who's a single guy, but still talks to the refs and jokes with them and has some fun with them and laughs and treats his mom and dad with so much deep respect. And so I wanted to put a pin on that. But
Yeah.
back to what you asked me, which was, I think it's what I said earlier, in the sense that what I've come to understand is that way too often in human performance, we focus a lot on the output. So how high
Right.
can somebody jump?
Yep.
How fast are they? What they have pain. How do I treat that pain? They have movement dysfunction. How do I fix that movement dysfunction? Those are all fundamentally outputs.
Right.
So what I recognized years ago was that if we were going to get better and more lasting and more valued solutions, we had to acknowledge how the brain received inputs and what those inputs were. And 2 of them are ones that are really ignored profoundly by most people in human performance. One of which is the most important, which is your visual system. And the second is your vestibular system. We don't learn a lot about that in exercise science or strength conditioning or performance or even the clinical models. We learn a little bit about vestibular systematics because of, vertigo and some really disease-centric issues. But in general, in terms of optimization, improvement, or making sure that those 3 systems actually are integrating and talking to each other well, that's not something we learn in school or even a approach to work on. So fundamentally, we've always worked on the outputs. And I would say the same thing about your industry.
Yeah.
Your industry works on the outputs. What is this person thinking,
Right.
doing? What are their behaviors?
Yep.
Then our focal lens becomes, how do we get them to adjust those thoughts?
Exactly.
How do we get them to adjust those actions? So we give them skills to work on those things. We give them exercises, drills, etc. But it's all output centric. And from an input perspective, it tends to bias towards a certain kind of inputs that the person can hear or feel or whatever. We don't necessarily look at, is their visual system working, their vestibular system working? Are they in physiological threat? So no matter what you tell them to do, they're always going to feel threatened because they have a visual system that doesn't work, or they have an integration system that doesn't work. They're not making, and this is why I think when we look at our children today, we're not understanding the true nature of what's happening with them and phones and computers and not moving and being physical, because we grew up, and I said this earlier, playing on my
Right.
skateboard or playing outside. We were unintentionally challenging the visual, vestibular, proprioceptive systems by playing with our buddies, by
Exactly.
being in the basement with my skateboard. Now, what we're doing is we're taking this phone,
Mm-hmm.
we're making this be our whole skill set with our visual system. Our imagination is being destroyed because it's not allowing us to integrate and create interpretation and explore. It's all being fed to us, right? So at
Mm.
the end of the day, our younger kids now, we're having to fight all of that. And so when you ask me what reconditioning is about, it's about recognizing that we need to work with the inputs. We need to work with how the system interprets and integrates information to create better outputs. And in all of that, there is a psychological, sociological, and physiological lens to all of this, and biomechanical lens that I need to understand. And you could also go one step further and say there's a nutritional lens to that. Your gut health, the gut is the secondary brain in some, as some people speak of it. So if your gut's not happy, your brain's not happy. So for far too long in our industries, people have become silo specific and silo controlling because it's ego that drives that. The other thing that drives it is litigation. So I'm in mental performance. We set up all these rules and regulations for how
Mhm.
the mental performance practitioner can or can't talk about these secrets of the person. And I get all of that. I understand it. There are things that people live through that shouldn't necessarily be everybody else's purview. But fundamentally, if I'm a performance coach and the kid over here had a traumatic moment in their life where they were beaten by their father, da 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 da, and that has set them up for an interpretive lens that's different, a threat lens that is different. I can work my ass off to make them better. If I don't understand that, I can't help them.
Right now.
So it's sometimes a bit of a tough world to play in, but fundamentally, we working together have to understand it all matters.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
that's, to me, again, the reconditioning model is to understand that it all matters. I need to understand what's gone on in the background noise to the best of our ability and work with the person in front of me to overcome the threat, understand how they're interpreting information, integrating information, and producing outputs. And when I do that, I get better solutions to my problems.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. No, it's beautiful. And I'm glad you brought up the youth aspect of it, right? Of like, when you look back and you start to think about what the new world is and how we grew up and all that. So it's a little bit of a different lens. But if you were coming up now and you're thinking about yourself of mistakes you made as a young professional, right? As a young performance coach coming up, what advice would you give of just seeing the way the world is now, but now taking the interpretation of who you were back then and saying, you know what? Hey, kid, here's what you have to pay attention to. Because again, by you phrasing it that way, you are getting to that spiritual sense of your nature. So you can speak to it, even though we all know, well, experience changes you, but you knew, right? You would know yourself back then. What will be the thing? What will be the advice now that youth coming up, there's somebody young listening to it, that you'd give of like, here's one thing I'd avoid making a mistake on that when I was younger, put me potentially in poor positions.
Well, if I was counseling myself today, my conversation would be about sharing my opinion less, and my authority of that opinion I should diminish. So I think when I was younger, I had, it's funny, clearer lenses of what I believed was right, and I was more apt to share those.
Clearer.
And so now I have a more, call it muddier lens
All right.
that I recognize needs to have more context brought to it. And I need to find more subtlety in the way that I share or express things, and less certainty in it, and more sort of sensitivity towards how we're all just trying to learn more and understand things better and find better solutions. And so that would be what I would share to myself, and I share to younger practitioners that I'm working with is, you don't know what you don't know. And one of my mentors said to me, whenever you feel you know something, ask yourself what you know, why do you know it, and why is it wrong?
Mm. Yep.
Always look at, because there'll be things that you believe right now that you find out don't work later on, right? So
No
it's
doubt.
a little less, again, it's an interesting dichotomy, because from a sense of understanding and knowledge brings confidence that you then apply to expression, right?
Mm.
So there's this kind of double-edged sword of knowing and feeling like you get it so that you can then deliver it and expose it. But I guess what I am trying to get better at now is recognizing that my first volley shouldn't necessarily be about the what I believe is the truth, even if it is in some sense. It
Right.
should be more understanding what their truth is or what their belief is and how they see things, and then sort of trying to understand it from that perspective, or understanding why they're where they are,
Yeah. I love that. I love that. Well, it starts to bring us towards, the end here of where, I start to think about how much you've grown, over the last decade, right? And leave your mark, right? You started the podcast and you got going with that part. You know, talk about how going through that journey for you, and what do you feel that changed about you as a human being, of where when you first started out, walk us through the progression of when you first started out, what were you thinking about that you wanted it to be? And then now that you've gone through it for so long, what has it actually turned out to be in
Right.
your experience?
Well, it's funny. I haven't really thought about that before, but in having this conversation, I think that's where great conversations lie. Um, I told you what what I know to be my purpose. I think in doing the podcast, I actually found that and could find the language for it and say it. Um, and then recognize that Leave Your Mark was a part of that expression of who I am. So in the podcast rests my purpose, challenging convention, creating change, inspiring people. And I do that through conversation, recognizing the way other people do things. It might be different than the way I do things, or maybe different than the way you do things, but these are successful people, et cetera, et cetera. So what I wanted it to be, probably my ego wanted it to be this really cool podcast that lots of people would listen to, and it would somehow create some kind of resonant wake in the front of it. What it has become is an opportunity for me to have great conversations with people I probably would not necessarily have ever connected with, to learn about their lives, to recognize that we're all going through this learning as we go, and becoming, as I said, iteratively better and better versions of ourselves. And it now allows me a conduit or opportunity to use it to experience what makes me most joyful, which is, conversation and learning and exploring and being me.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So I guess we'll kind of finish off on, from an evolving athlete standpoint, right? And you think about the duality of the nature of it, right? What is the aspect of, as an evolving athlete, that you've enjoyed most from where you began and where you see it ending?
Mm. I think, like, it's a nice question to finish on. I think it is recognizing that it's not about climbing any one mountain. It's not about the the speed at which you get there, or um, the even how you prepared for the journey at the beginning of it. It's all about each one of those mountain climbs providing an experience that then shapes you for the next mountain climb and the next mountain climb, and recognizing you're never going to stop climbing mountains. And so the mountain itself is no longer the focal lens. It's really about everything about the climb, how you prepared yourself, what you experienced, who you experienced it with along the way, what it felt like when you got to the top in one place and another, etc. And the more you do that, the more you recognize what you would enjoy about it and what you don't, and what you want more of and what you want less of. And over time you start to create that as a filter for how you explore each and every mountain. So, maybe you don't off-road on your mountain climb because you don't really enjoy off-roading. You like being on the path. Or maybe you enjoy hacking and whacking and going through the forest, and so you hack and whack, but you recognize what it is that you enjoy. And that's, I think, your permission point as you get older, is to recognize that, you did the hacking and whacking, you didn't enjoy it, it didn't resonate with you. So why are you still doing it now? You should be doing the mountain the way you like to do the mountain,
Beautiful, man. Beautiful. Well, as always, I love when we get to nerd out and have these type of discussions, man. And, I really appreciate you taking the time, obviously, to share not only your story, but the lessons, right, and those insights that you've picked up along the way. That's the whole point of, what we're here for. And, what I love about the conversation is how it shows that it's evolving as an athlete, as a person, most importantly, right, isn't about just holding on to that one role or identity or that title, right? It's about making sure that we're carrying forward, to your point with the mountains, right, the things that matter the most to us, adapting when life changes, and, finding those new ways to leave your mark, right, as we go, which I love, brother. For anyone listening, who wants to connect with you or learn more about your work, where's the best place for them to find you?
They can find me on Instagram at King O'Pain, or they can find me at our Reconditioning HQ website. So it's reconditioninghq.com, or they can find me at lymlab.com, which is the podcast. And they can listen to the podcast. Leave Your Mark is pretty much on every streaming service. So you can find me, and it's got half my face with Leave Your Mark on the other side. So you'll recognize the bald guy in the
badass picture. That's all. They got your good side, buddy.
I hope so. Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you so much again, for
You're
joining
welcome.
today, man. You've been a friend.
Thanks for inviting me to be your first guy.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's been awesome. You've been a friend, mentor, and huge influence right on my journey. So I know listeners will take a lot from what they heard and what you shared today. So to everyone tuning in, if you enjoyed this episode, make sure you subscribe to Evolving Athletes Podcast with Coach Vinny Malts, so you don't miss future conversations. And remember, keep evolving on and off the field.